Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Velero community meeting and open discussion. With us today, we got the community, the Velero team and the community, of course. So we're going to dive right into it. We're going to go over some status updates. We have some discussion and topics, and I believe Steve wanted to do a demo as well of a new functionality. If you have any questions, you can either put them here in the Zoom chat or you can add them to the HackMD notes here. So, and we'll cover them throughout the day or the session here rather. And with that, let's kick things off. So status updates, who wants to go first?
I can go. So I've been looking at the issues with the generated CRDs in 1.13 and below. And it seems like the issues just mostly around Kubernetes not initially supporting the nullable field in the schema for that. So it doesn't seem like there's a good way around it apart from if we change the meta v1 time types to pointers, I think that will mitigate most of the issues. That way, the client will just emit those fields and not set them to null when it creates objects, which seems like the right way. It's kind of odd that the client's actually setting those to null anyway. And I tried to see if there was a faster way to fix this for now in the meantime, but it doesn't seem like there is. There's no way to just disable the validation. I tried forcing the type using the kube-builder annotations, but since OpenAPI schema doesn't support a null type, that doesn't work. So yeah, I think our only option here really is to switch to pointers for the meta v1 time types.
Do you have any sense of whether there might be any issues as we go further back in kube versions? Like, if someone installs on 1.10, if there'll be any further compatibility issues?
No, I haven't actually tested it. I guess what do we claim to support with Velero? Do we have?
I mean, I think we don't really have an official policy, or we've generally made a best effort to retain as much backwards compatibility as we can. I can't remember what the version is that we currently are saying we support. I think it's whatever version has deployments in the apps group. Since we made that switch, which is like, I don't know, 1.9 or 1.10.
I think. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can go back and check on 1.9. 1.9 has the security issue as well that, and I think 1.10 might have one as well that wasn't patched. So Kubernetes only supports the last 3, but then that's not really realistic because things like GKE and stuff take some time to update as well. So yeah, I can have a look at 1.9, 1.10 and see what a compatibility like is there as well.
Okay, I think that'd be good. Like, I just basically, if we're saying that we're not supporting an older version, I just want to be aware of it and make sure that it seems reasonable, and then that we communicate it as part of the release.
Yeah, that sounds good. And it may be that we have a way to just revert. Sorry, there is another option that I forgot, which is to, if we detect an older version of Kubernetes, we just skip the validations on the CRD when we go and create them, and that might be a good way of having that backwards compatibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
That's it. Other than that, I want to take some time to look back into the CSI stuff this week to prepare for the KubeCon talk.
Nice. Any other questions for Adnan? All right, let's move on to Carlicia.
Hi, everybody. So I'm gonna work from the bottom of my list. So I have a draft PR sitting, just waiting for the moment that we can extract the plugins from the Velero code base. And I did some rebasing with the changes for the new GitHub organization move. there is an updated version of the Velero plugin example. There are also the updates that needed to happen for the move to the new GitHub organization. And finally, I have the AWS plugin and building an image, at least locally. I need to figure out how to properly send it to a repository. And what I'm going to do next is I'm in the process of moving the documentations to this plugin project for AWS and going to test it against an AWS cluster. And then after that, just replicate the same thing for the other two plugins.
Sounds good. So we'll basically, once we get the plugin repos set up and images building, I guess at that point, we'll go ahead with merging the PR to remove all that code from the core Velero code base, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm keeping it up to date as I shift things. Like, for example, now I'm moving the documentation, so I'm going to update that PR to remove the documentation from there.
Okay, makes sense. And I know we touched base on this last week, but the only PR I'm aware of that's open right now that impacts the cloud providers is the Azure one that is in review right now. So hopefully, once we get that merged, then the cloud provider code there will be kind of frozen.
Yeah, exactly.
Question for you, Carlisa. Did the Velero plugins, they will be separate repositories under the same org, right?
Right.
Did we settle on the naming standard for those yet?
I'll let Steve talk about that.
Okay.
Or Amanda. It's in progress. The answer is no. If anybody wants to chime in any details, I don't know.
Yeah, this is Tim. We're still working out some of those details right now.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, I didn't realize Tim was on the call.
Sounds good. Any other questions? All right, let's move on to Nolan.
Yeah, so I've got a PR in draft status. It's mostly waiting on me to do some more testing, but essentially that would make Velero wait for a CRD to actually be ready to use before continuing with restore. Right now, we see race conditions with the CRDs, so a lot of times we'll restore CRDs and can move on to the we move straight on to the custom resources, but sometimes the CRD is not ready when we get to a custom resource. So this would hopefully mitigate that race condition, but I want to do some more testing just to be sure. I'm also starting to prep KubeCon talk with Adnan, doing some internal testing on our vSphere CNS product with Restic, making sure that all plays nice. And also I've done some initial work on getting a Docker Hub registry set up for Velero. So it will be moving from the GCR space to Docker Hub. No timeline on that currently. And I think we should probably have at least a couple months of overlap where we have GCR and Docker Hub that have images available, but it's there. The organization exists. We just haven't started pushing anything to it yet. I think last week I mentioned I will push maybe 0.11, 1.0, and 1.1 images up to Docker Hub just so they're there. So people can, if they're on old ARC images, they can migrate, but we're not going to move all the old versions over.
Can you talk a little about the reason why we're moving over to Docker Hub instead of continuing GCR?
GCR is kind of a pain to manage. It's good if you want a really basic registry. It also has to do with rebranding. The repo is Heptio images, and we want to change that anyway. The other thing is with this Docker Hub org, we can both narrow the scope, so we just have Velero images in there. Right now we have a whole ton of images in the Heptio images bucket, but we can also expand it so that you can get your Velero, because we're like bundling the cloud provider plugins as images, you can get those in the same spot. So it's also probably a little bit easier for people to find, and for us, we get a little bit more visibility into statistics.
Awesome, thank you. Any questions for Noel? All right, let's move over to Steve.
Yeah, the main things I've been working on in the last couple of days. So the first one is we had a contributor from Microsoft who put up a PR for adding support in the Azure plugins for the China and German clouds. So in Azure, there's a US public cloud, there's a China cloud, a German cloud, maybe one or two others, and they all have different endpoints. So our current implementation of the Azure plugin only supported the US cloud. So this PR added support for the other ones. I've just been helping get a couple of the feedback items addressed. So hopefully that's ready for merge relatively soon. And then I've also been working on a prototype of taking the Restic functionality and putting it behind the volume snapshotter plugin interface. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but for those of you who are familiar with the Restic integration, it has its own user experience. It also has its own code path within Velero that's kind of totally separate from the other volume snapshotters, so like the EBS snapshotter and the Azure and GCP snapshotters. And we've had a lot of discussions since the Restic functionality has been added about possibly looking at ways to make both the code and the UX for Restic more similar to the other volume snapshot implementations. So I've basically just been doing some prototyping here, trying to see if and how it could work to put it behind a volume snapshotter, and hopefully spur discussion on whether that makes sense. So I'll get into some more detail on that in a minute.
Cool. I don't think we have any questions, so yeah, let's move into that.
Yeah, sure. I guess maybe I'll just start with the demo and kind of show what it looks like, and then we can talk some more about it. So let me share my screen here. And yeah, so standard full disclaimers. This is really just a prototype. There are a bunch of things that are hard coded or otherwise hacked in various ways. So don't take this as working code whatsoever. So anyway, what I have here, I have a cluster running. I've got my custom build of Velero in here. The workload that I'm going to back up and restore is in this NS1. And I guess I can show you Velero plugin get, which lists all the plugins that are registered. So if you look right at the bottom here, you'll see that there's a new one, which is a velero.io/restic, and it's a volume snapshotter. So this is the new code that I've added. So the first thing I'll do is just take a backup of NS1. So let me first show you what's in there. So deploys, pods, PVCs. So I've got a basic deployment in this namespace. It's just running a single pod, which isn't really doing anything apart from using this one persistent volume claim. And that claim is basically just on I'm running on GKE right now. So this is just a GCE persistent disk. And if I actually exec into the pod in this namespace, the PVC is just mounted in this directory PVC1. And if I look at what's in here, I've got a hello world file and I've also just got the Velero code base checked out here. So I'm just going to back up that workload using the Rustic volume snapshotter. So I'll just say Velero backup create demo and include namespaces NS1. And let me actually just stream the logs down here for the server pod so we can sort of see what's happening. So I'll kick off the backup. You can see kind of at the bottom here, there's some logs related to the Rustic snapshotter. I'll talk a little bit more about how this works in a minute, but it looks like it's already basically finished. So there we go. So the backup's completed. So if I just do a describe on it with the details flag. So normally if you're using Rustic, you'll have a section at the bottom here that says, I forget if it says Rustic backups or pod volume backups, but you see that you don't get that with this one. So instead you just get the normal kind of persistent volume snapshot section. We have the persistent volume that was backed up, and then in the snapshot ID field. So normally if you're using, you know, say the GCP snapshotter, you'd get some GCP identifier here. But this snapshot ID is actually a Rustic snapshot ID. And I can show that in the Rustic repo itself. So basically 0BD is this snapshot here, which was just created. And I can even run a Rustic command just to list what's in that snapshot. And yeah, we get the whole, basically a listing of that whole Velero code base. So, anyway, so far we've got a Rustic snapshot. I guess I'll pause there and talk briefly about how that's actually working. So in the existing Rustic implementation, backups are taken through a Rustic daemon set. So we have the main Velero server basically creates a pod volume backup custom resource. And then the Rustic daemon set is watching for new pod volume backups that are created. And the daemon set pod that's running on the same node as the volume to be backed up actually triggers the Rustic backup. I changed in this prototype, I changed how that works a little bit. So there is no longer a daemon set. If you look at what's running in the Velero namespace, there's no Rustic daemon set. So instead, what I'm doing is the volume snapshotter plugin is actually spinning up kind of an on-demand worker pod, which is specifically scheduled to run on the appropriate node. And that worker pod just has a host path mount. So it's still using the approach of mounting the host path of rlib kubelet pods subdirectory to get access at the data. I guess one nice thing about the way it's working currently is that it can be mounted as read-only because we're only doing a backup. We're not actually restoring data through that. So anyway, let me go ahead and delete the namespace here just so I can kick off the restore. While this is deleting, let me just pause there and see if anyone has any questions or comments so far.
So in a worker pod, could we just mount the volume that we want to back up rather than the whole nodes pods volume directory?
Potentially, yeah. So what I actually have it doing now is just I think mounting the subdirectory of rlib kubelet pods that's for the pod that's using the PV that we're backing up. So we're at least, we're not mounting every single pod's subdirectory. We're narrowing it down to one pod. We might be able to narrow that down even further, so it's only mounting the specific directory for the persistent volume that we're trying to back up.
Seems like we could also just mount the persistent volume directly, pointing to the same PVC.
So that potentially gets tricky because you could do that for read-write many volumes, but many volumes are not read-write many, and so you can't actually mount them into multiple pods at a time.
if you mount it read-only, though, are you? I think read-only many you can. Sorry, read-write once you can mount read-only in multiple pods. I'm not sure though. I might be wrong. I need to look that up.
Yeah, we could look at that. I was under the impression that we couldn't do that, at least not like in a general way. But definitely something worth looking at.
I think I'm thinking of read-only many.
Yeah, and is that supported by all the providers?
It is, but if you have read-write once, then you can only mount that in a single node.
Got it. Yeah.
So yeah, we still have that problem.
Yeah, and that's kind of the challenge of, that's definitely a challenge with running a backup and like where do you get access to the data? I mean, I guess the other approach you can take is using a sidecar container that actually runs in the pod that you're trying to back up, but that requires adding a sidecar to every workload that you want to back up.
Yeah.
Which, it is another approach that could be considered, but it's not the one that we chose initially and not what I'm doing right now.
Plus that would restart the pod as well.
Yeah, and that was part of the reason that we kind of wanted not to take that approach.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so namespace is deleted, the PV is deleted, so I'm going to go ahead and run a restore. What I'm actually going to do down here, just so that I can explain this, is I'm going to put a watch on persistent volume so we can see what happens. So I'll say, what's my backup called? Demo. Velero restore create from backup demo. And then, so the restore is also going to be using a kind of an on-demand helper pod. So you'll see right here, there's this, in the Velero namespace, there's this new pod called Restic Restorer that's currently creating. So we can look at the logs for that. It's probably already finished. Yeah, it's actually already done, so. And the entire restore is done. So let's just take a look at what pods exist. In that namespace, it's up and running. So I'll just exec back into that pod now and go into that PVC subdirectory, and we get our hello world file and get our Velero code base. So everything got restored. So if you look at what's happening on the bottom here with the PVs, I'll kind of walk through this and explain what's happening with the restore. So the first thing is that we spin up a PV, and it's actually claimed by a persistent volume claim in the Velero namespace. So we spin up this worker pod in the Velero namespace, and we essentially dynamically provision a new empty persistent volume to restore into, which is consistent with the existing Restic implementation. But then within this worker pod, we run a Restic restore. So that actually restores all the data into this persistent volume. Now the kind of trick here is that we set the reclaim policy on the persistent volume here to retain, which says that essentially when we delete it, the cloud volume won't be removed by the volume provisioner. So then we essentially delete the persistent volume and persistent volume claim that were used by the Velero namespace. And so we're left with a cloud volume that actually has data on it. And then from that point, we just go ahead with recreating a persistent volume that specifically uses that cloud volume that we just populated. And then we just let the workload, essentially set up a PVC to claim that persistent volume and to mount it into the pod as usual. So it's kind of this approach where we have a worker pod that's pre-populating a cloud volume or a storage volume, and then that storage volume is getting then mounted into the workload pod. So yeah, I'll pause there and see if anyone has any other comments or questions.
So you said that this was using a worker pod design. Excuse me. Has that informed anything? Has it informed your thinking on the worker pod design doc that we have? Have you reconsidered anything? Has it posed any challenges? Or I'm just curious how the worker pod design has kind of worked out here.
Yeah, well, so the design doc that's out there was for introducing worker pods for like backups and restores, Velero backups and restores, which I still think makes sense. But that design that doc led me to think about, is there a way that we could use a similar approach for RESTIC backups and restores? And that definitely led me to the approach that's being used here. I think it's difficult to implement RESTIC inside a volume snapshot or interface without using some kind of worker pod. I guess you could potentially take essentially all of the code that we currently have inside Velero for dealing with RESTIC and essentially move it behind a volume snapshot or interface, but you'd still need to have like separate daemon sets running, and you need to have custom CRDs. And so these would all be would be a necessary part of having the plugin run, but wouldn't actually be able to be deployed as part of the plugin. So with this approach, the plugin itself is just spinning up the worker pods. So it's all kind of self-contained. And there are some nice things about using that approach. I mean, on the restore, I guess the thing that I didn't point out here is that because we're actually we set up a worker pod, we create a PVC, and we do a restore into that PVC. We don't need to do any kind of host path mount to do the restore. We don't need any kind of a init container to wait for the restore to be completed. We run one pod that populates the volume, and then we essentially, let the workload just spin up with that pre-populated volume. So the flow is a little bit nicer. It means we never need a read-write mount of the host path, which I think is definitely nice from a kind of a data protection perspective.
Could we move it to a separate repository?
Yeah, absolutely. If we decide to go with this approach, then this would just become a separate volume snapshot or plugin like anything else, similar to the approach we're taking for the existing ones.
I guess the difference there would be that we would have to figure out how we play nice with the PVBs, pod volume backups and pod volume restores, because those are currently core data types for Velero, but in this paradigm, they move into a plugin, but the core of Velero still uses them, right? So, although your output on the on the describe just showed it on the PVs, so
yeah. So the volume snapshot or prototype is not using the PVB or PVR types at all. So it's instead of using those to signal that a RESTIC operation needs to happen, it's basically just creating a worker pod whose command to run is essentially RESTIC backup or RESTIC restore. So we skip using those at all. That does bring up the question of like, if we're going to go with this approach, what does that mean for the existing implementation? Does it mean we're deprecating it? Does it mean we're dropping it at some point, et cetera?
And something you had mentioned before, because I think you said of the survey respondents, only 3 people were using non-PVCs or like scratch ders or empty ders, because this is from the implementation side for us, it's sounding to me a little simpler, but it does mean we can't back up stuff that's directly on a pod.
Correct. Yeah.
It has to be through a PVC PV, which reduces the tool's flexibility.
Correct. And that's the biggest thing, that's definitely the biggest drawback from a user perspective, is that we would be removing that functionality of being able to back up arbitrary pod volumes. I think there are lots of benefits to having it fit into the the kind of standard snapshot model. And so definitely like looking for user input on, whether dropping support for that is a major issue or not.
I'd also be curious, I guess this would actually remove some of the exceptions we have in the code base. Like we had some exceptions for how Rustic is treated on CSI volumes, but if we use this, then they would presumably all get treated the same.
Yeah, we'll have to look at the details. I mean, it definitely, would remove a lot of the kind of custom code that's there for Rustic, but yeah, we'd have to kind of go through each section of it.
And I also want to bring up something that Adnan asked in the chat. So Adnan, can you ask your question?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I was just curious what the historical reason was behind not starting with Rustic support in a plugin and baking it in.
I think it was kind of a result of like the possible technical approaches that we saw to running Rustic. And so we came up with this approach of using the host path of varlib kubelet. And because of that, like you're basically, especially on restore, you're basically required to have the pod up and running before you can actually do a restore, because otherwise the volumes don't exist, the volume mounts don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, it couldn't fit into a volume snapshotter plugin using that model, because the volume snapshotters run for PVs, and that happens before any pod gets created that actually uses the PV. So I think, because of that approach, we decided that it basically needed to execute kind of through the pods, and so necessitated a separate code path. In retrospect, I don't know that it was necessarily the right decision, but that's kind of where it is. Yeah.
I also think at the time, our volume snapshot plugin API was fairly new. If I remember right, the plugin architecture came along in 0.7, and then Rustic support was 0.9. And I think it was, in some ways, it was trying to bootstrap supporting things that weren't already on the plugin model. And we had fewer people kind of flexing the plugin model to see what it could do.
Yeah. There are like a bunch of other things that I haven't quite figured out, or that we still need to talk about, if we're going to go with this model. One of them is definitely like how Rustic repository management works. So right now Velero kind of manages the Rustic repository lifecycle, and that it initializes them when they're needed for a given backup storage location. It runs maintenance on them, which effectively is running the Rustic prune operation. There's a question, if we go with this approach, is that still something that like core Velero should do? Because theoretically, if you move all this Rustic backup and restore code behind a plugin interface, you can move it out of the core Velero repo, and now Velero doesn't necessarily need to know about Rustic anymore. So there's a question for me of like, should we move to a kind of bring your own Rustic repository model where we just make the user responsible for setting up their own Rustic repository and essentially, configuring their backup storage location to tell Velero where it is or tell the plugin where it is. And then in that scenario, the user would kind of be responsible for running Rustic prune on whatever schedule they wanted to run it. So that's one option. We could also like take the existing Rustic repository controller. We could keep running it inside Velero. I think that's potentially an option. We could also spin it out into its own separate deployment. And just, if folks are running Rustic, they could, Velero install could set up this separate deployment that's running this controller. So I'm not totally sure what makes sense there. the bring your own repository model is appealing from a kind of simplicity of code perspective in Velero, but it may also be, you know, less convenient for users. So
yeah, and having
sure.
Having this, hearing you talk about this makes me think about having a separate Restic deployment that is just for managing Restic repos. It doesn't really have a whole lot to do with Velero. Velero can consume those repos, but that might be an interesting thing to do for us to consume that. I don't know if there's anything that exists for that. But I do know from our perspective, we've had users, there are users that want to kind of dig into Restic and get the full support out of it. And they want to be able to go and manage the repo. They do want to manage the repo themselves and manage their own keys and stuff like that. And while the current support is nice for people who don't want to do that, because it just does it for you, for people who do, it doesn't really help them. They're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I think, you know, when we initially implemented Restic, there was this desire to kind of like totally hide Restic, you know, as an implementation detail behind the Velero interface, so that theoretically users wouldn't even really need to know about Restic. But I think we found that that's just not practical. Like, it's a very leaky abstraction, and you know, you definitely require some in-depth knowledge of what's going on with Restic. And so given that, I wonder if it's, you know, if it makes more sense to just say, hey, you can create your repos wherever you want, you can manage them however you want, you just need to give Velero a, you know, the identifier to your repo, credentials to access it, which means both, you know, potentially like S3 credentials as well as the encryption password. But if you put that in a secret and configure your backup storage location to specify what that secret is, then Velero can connect to it for taking backups and restores.
Restic also has, I'm remembering when we first designed the Restic support, Restic also has their proxy server, which, going back to that deployment idea, if the deployment existed in the, a deployment of that proxy server existed in the cluster, that's something we might be able to use. I think the API was slightly different though. I can't remember if it was like an S3 alike HTTP API or not, but it was basically a way to not give every pod credentials to the bucket. So you just say, hey, all you go to the proxy, and the proxy would be able to write to the bucket.
Yeah,
but that would probably be a little different. Like, I don't know how that would work with our location support.
Yeah, it's definitely something we could take a look at. I don't remember all the details of it. Trying to remember if there's anything else I wanted to point out about this. Yeah, I guess at this point I'm, you know, sort of looking for input on, is this something that seems worthwhile to continue pursuing? I mean, I'm definitely not at the point yet where, you know, I'm like ready to cut the ribbon on this and move ahead with implementation. There's still a bunch of things to be figured out, but if we think it's something that's worthwhile to spend some more time on, I can continue to investigate and, you know, write up notes and try and point out all the different things that we need to figure out.
My 2 cents is I really like that this brings Restic more in line with the rest of how volume snapshotters work. It's not this huge exception to how things work. There's questions in my mind, the big questions are around migration of what people currently have. Like, even though I know our stuff's Restic supports beta, I don't really want to orphan people's backups if we could avoid it. But I think from my perspective, it simplifies a large design portion of Velero, and I would like to see like a design doc, because I like this prototype and I like that we've explored the idea, but I think we should get more community feedback, because I especially want to hear from people who may be affected by dropping arbitrary support for arbitrary pod volumes, that kind of thing.
For sure, yeah. You know, I've kind of asked the question on the Slack channel before and didn't get any response, but you know, we can certainly make a bigger push to solicit input on this, because I agree, given that it's potentially gonna, you know, break or remove functionality for certain users, we need to make sure that it makes sense.
Yeah, I think as a design doc or an issue, it can be a little bit longer lived. So no guarantee that we'll get input, but I want to give people a chance to see that this is coming if it happens.
Yeah, and then it's also searchable. Slack isn't externally searchable, so we can find this in the history if we have an issue or a design doc as well.
Yeah, for sure.
This is really cool, Steve.
Quick question around the UX of the Velero backup details. Is there a way of knowing that was a RESTIC backup? Is there a way we can make that more obvious?
Yeah, good question. I'm sure we could.
One idea could be in snapshot ID, we could do RESTIC : / or something like that.
Yeah, it would probably make sense in here to capture, like, you know, which plugin was used, essentially, which volume snapshotter was used to create the snapshot. So that should be something that would be easy to add to the metadata we store and then display it here.
Cool.
One other thing we may run into is that we may need to actually add some arguments to some of the, or add some parameters to some of the volume snapshotter interfaces, which I need to think about how we can do in a way that doesn't break existing things, or whether we're going to need to cut a 2.0 to be able to do that. But that's just one of the details I need to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, it sounds like this is something that is worth continuing to pursue. So I'll plan to continue to spend some more time with the goal of kind of getting material out there that other folks can review and provide input on.
I think that sounds great, Steve. Let's see. We don't have any open Q&A in the notes. So I think we should move into the contributor shoutouts. Let me share my screen again. Steve, do you want to speak these?
Yeah, I can go through these since I added them here. Yeah, we've had a few good contributions in the last week or two. So the first one is from Jay Wong 101, who added support for workload identity on GKE. So this is a new feature that GKE is offering, where you can it's kind of like Cube to IAM for AWS, where you can actually use GCP service accounts for pod identity within your GKE clusters. It's still a beta feature as far as I know in GKE, but we have the support for it now. So thanks a lot, Jay Wong 101, for adding support there. And then we had Boxy, who added support within our Azure plugins for doing cross-subscription backups and restores. So we've had support for doing kind of cross-resource group backups and restores in Azure, but this actually enhances it so that you can create backups in a totally separate subscription and then restore them into a different subscription as well. And that works for both for the standard Kubernetes metadata as well as persistent volume snapshots. So that's a great addition. So thanks a lot, Boxy. And then SpiffCS. I think this was the second PR that we've gotten in a couple of weeks from this contributor. So added some more documentations around the schedule custom resource to bring the documentation there up to kind of in line with the backup and restore documentation. So really appreciate that. That's super helpful for users.
Awesome. Thank you all contributors.
Oh, I wanted to toss another one in there. Anthony, who's on the call, thank you for digging into a lot of work on making Velero a component of a larger backup system, particularly the work around making backup storage locations optional to start. That's going to be really helpful once we get that merged in.
Yeah. Thanks, Nolan. Yeah. So right now we have. I'm still working with with you guys for the review for those, but we have the integration going on. So any issues we find, we're just going to work with you guys and just try to get integration working well. And yeah, thanks for all your help as well. You guys have been really helpful with the review. And we have a new team member who joined us, Yunchen. I think you might have seen he submitted a pull request. So yeah, I'm working with him on that too. So far it's going good. And thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Hi, hello, Steve. Hello, Nolan. This is Yunchen. I'm a new employee in Bell EMC. And right now I am working with Anthony to focus on add some new features to the Velero. And I really like this community, Velero, and I really enjoy it. And besides, thanks for Steve and Nolan to give me some feedback about my pull request.
Yeah, so I had one question. I know in Velero 1.1 we had a beta release. So there we could get you were soliciting for early feedback on that release. Do we have any timeline for when the beta for 1.2 will come out?
Yeah, I'd say we've kind of been waiting because we're planning to extract the internal plugins into their own repositories, and so we've kind of been waiting until we're able to get those separate repos stood up and get those images published. But I think we could consider cutting an alpha now. I mean, we have had a bunch of PRs that have been merged since 1.1, so maybe we could look at just cutting an alpha now, so folks could test out the existing functionality, and then once the plugin split out kind of gets completed, we could cut our first beta. Is that something that would be valuable for you?
Yeah. So just to get something to test against, and also just offer any feedback that we have before the next release goes out. So I'll be keeping a loop on that, and when it comes out, I'll definitely work with you guys on what I find out.
Okay, sounds good. Well, yeah, we'll decide if we want to do an alpha or not. I mean, there are always the master tagged images that'll let you try out the current latest master build. Although those are liable to be broken at any given point since it is active development branch.
Yeah.
And speaking of, we should probably try to fix this Velero install stuff, CRD stuff, before getting any alpha out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your feedback and questions here. All right. I think that's it for today. Thank you all for joining the Velero community call and open discussion. Thank you to the Velero team, and thank you to the Velero community. You all rock. Have a fantastic week, everyone. And this recording will be up on YouTube shortly. Have a good one, everyone.
So,
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.